Shalom, everyone. All right, as you can see tonight, we're going to be talking about what is the Old and New Covenant. And I must say, this is one of my favorite teachings. When I learned about what is the Old and New Covenant, it really kind of changed my life. And it kind of changed my theology in a lot of different ways. Hopefully it will for you tonight as well. And I just wanted to mention real quick, I am going to go extremely fast tonight, because tonight I have 50 slides to cover, which leaves me less than 2 minutes per slide. Okay? So, I'm already behind, yes. So, this class is pretty much self-explanatory. I don't expect a lot of questions, but then again, you never know. But basically, this is going to be a very unique class than the ones we've gone over before, because we're going to be studying only 2 passages tonight, and that's basically it. We're going to only have time to cover 2 passages, and you'll see what those are in a second. All right, so let's go ahead and get started since we're about to cover. All right, and you can kind of see what you can't really see it too well on the screen here, but we have here the 10 Commandments on stone, and we have the 10 Commandments as well on heart. And we're going to see the significance of that here tonight. Okay? And this is a biblical study of our relationship with the Mosaic Covenant. What exactly is our relationship as believers today? All right. So let's go a quick overview of what we're going to be covering tonight. The first thing we're going to cover is some traditional understandings of what the Old and New Covenant are. All right? So we're going to go over what most people think what the Old and New Covenant is. And then we're going to we're going to go over Jeremiah 31 through 34. Okay? Which I'm sure we're probably all familiar with. And then we're going to go over another passage, 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, which most of you are probably not familiar with. I know I wasn't for a long period of time. We're going to spend a majority of our time looking through that slide by slide, verse by verse, and then we have a conclusion of what we'll learn tonight, putting it all together. All right. And another thing, too, is, I guess I'll explain here in the next slide. Traditional understandings. All right. How some have understood what the Old and New Covenant is. All right. And this, by the way, just before we get into that, this teaching tonight is probably one of the most misunderstood doctrines for believers today. All right. So that's why I'm excited to teach it tonight. The first misunderstanding of what the Old and New Covenant are is a dispensational understanding, that the Old Covenant was in effect during a period of time in the past, before Yeshua died, and the New Covenant pertained in a period of time now after Yeshua died. So we have Old Covenant in the past, and New Covenant in the present. Right? Old Covenant was for them, New Covenant is for us. All right? That is a misunderstanding. That is not what the Old and New Covenant is. The other thing is that the Old Covenant and New Covenant are different types of laws, right? The Old Covenant is the law of Moses, and the New Covenant is the law of Messiah, right? The Old Covenant, that's for the Jews back then. We have the law of Messiah. That is not what the Old and New Covenant is. The other thing is that the Old Covenant and New Covenant is a spiritual versus physical thing. That the Old Covenant is about physical promises, and the New Covenant is about spiritual promise and eternal life, right? And primarily because of that, you don't see a lot of promises of eternal life in the Torah and in the prophets. And so a lot of people just assume that it's about earthly things. New Covenant is about heavenly and spiritual things. That is not what the Old and New Covenant is. And hopefully, and this is the last one is probably going to hit a little more closer to home, is the scriptural division. The Old Covenant is the first half of the Bible. The New Covenant is the second half. That is not what the Old and New Covenant is. All right? The Old Covenant is not the Tanakh. The New Covenant is not the Apostolic Scriptures. Okay? It's not not at all. And we're going to revisit this at the end. So, what is then? If this is not what the Old and New Covenant is, what is it? Well, let's go to the Scriptures themselves to see what they say the Old and New Covenant is. All right? So these are not what the Old and New Covenant is. Oh, by the way, on your sheets, because there's so much information to go over tonight, I'm going to kind of tell you what not to write down, because we're going to repeat them over at the end. So just keep that in mind. So try not to write everything down, because you're not going to have time to write everything down. But I put on the sheets what I felt was most important for you to kind of keep for yourself later. All right. Jeremiah 31 through 34. Let's just go ahead and read it. Since there's only 4 verses, this way we have a good, fresh understanding of what it says. It says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant in which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord." "But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel in those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more." All right. So let's just go through Jeremiah 31 and asking ourselves a few questions to kind of bring us on track of what is Old and New Covenant. Okay? So here we say, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord." We just read this. And so the first question is, and I'm going to ask you all this to answer these questions, when will God make the new covenant? When will God make the new covenant according to Jeremiah 31?
Sometime in the future.
Sometime in the future, when the days are coming, right? So it's future to Jeremiah. Everyone see that and agree with that? Okay. It's future to Jeremiah. The second question is, who does God make the new covenant with? It's okay. You guys can scream out.
The house of Israel.
The house of Israel and the house of Judah, right? Does it say anything about Gentiles? Okay. It does not say anything about Gentiles, but the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Okay? And we're going to talk about that here in a second. The next question, what covenant did God make with their fathers? What covenant is he referring to? The Mosaic covenant. Okay. Does everyone agree with that? Yes. Okay. And the next question is, what did their fathers do with that covenant that God made with them?
They broke their end.
They broke the covenant, right? Everyone see that? Not like the covenant made with them, the covenant in which they broke. So the covenant that God made with the house of Israel, house of Judah, their fathers, when they came out of Egypt, was a covenant which they broke. They did not keep it. All right? All right, moving on to the next section. "But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will write my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they will be my people." First question is, why is the house of Judah not mentioned? Does everyone see the house of Judah is not mentioned here? He did in the first verse, but not in this one. Does anybody have any idea why the house of Judah is not mentioned? The house of Judah is not mentioned because this is envisioning a time when both Israel and Judah become one nation again. See that? We see this in Ezekiel when the 2 sticks, and he puts the 2 sticks in his hand, there shall be one nation again. So this is referring to a time when Israel shall be again one nation, which is again future from Jeremiah. Does everyone see that? Okay. The other question is, what law does God put in and write on their heart? The Torah. Is it a different Torah? It's the same Torah. Right? But I thought he just said it was going to be a different covenant than one he made with them on Mount Sinai.
So it's the Mosaic law.
Well, that's what it says, right? I will write my law. What law is that?
Mosaic.
Mosaic law. But you just said that it's going to be not like the covenant he made with them. He made with the fathers, a covenant which they broke, right? All right. And then the next question for this section is, what is the significance of writing the law on the heart? Why does it say, I'll write the law on your hand? Or write my law on your head, your forehead. That's what the commandment are, to keep the law on the hand and on head, but he says, I'm going to write it on your heart. Why do you suppose he said on your heart? Go ahead.
I think because in the Brit Hadashah, it sums it up. It sums up all the laws and commandments under two things, and that's to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, body, and soul, and thy neighbor as thyself. So it sums it up as being love, and so the heart is a symbol of love.
Okay. Heart is a symbol of love. From our standard, it is, but from the Semitic mindset, is it? No.
It's the seat of the will.
It's the seat of the will, right? So basically, what is he? From the Semitic mindset, it's where the thinking takes place, right? It's not the head, because the head is where the life is. That's when we cut off somebody's head, you know that they're dead, right? But from the Semitic mindset, it's the heart is where all your thinking and decisions making takes place. And so what he's saying is, if I write the law in your heart, all your decisions that you're going to do is filtered through the Torah, right? So you're going to keep the Torah because why? It's where your decision making takes place. All right. So moving on to the next section. Who will not teach again his brother? Everyone? Does anybody else any answers for that? The reason why I ask you that question because that's a very common answer. Unfortunately, it's wrong.
Each man.
No. It says they will not teach again every man his brother. Who's the they?
Israel.
Israel. All right, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. We haven't changed antecedents here, right? He's still talking about the house of Israel, house of Judah. So the they is still referring to Judah. It's not referring to everyone on the face of the planet. It's referring to still a specific group of people.
So it's Judah, it's not the household.
It's Israel. It's Israel. Because remember, Israel is becoming one nation, right?
So it's the entire house of Israel.
Okay. All right. Next question is, what does it mean to know the Lord in this context? All right? What does it mean to know one thing to teach his brother or his neighbor? Know the Lord. What does that mean to know the Lord? Intimacy? So you have to teach your brother intimacy with the Lord?
Following the Torah.
What?
Following his precepts and his Torah.
Keeping his commandments. More specifically, to know the Lord in the Semitic mindset, again, in a covenantal sense, is to be faithful to the covenant. Right? And I don't have time to give a lot of examples on that, but to know the Lord is to be faithful to the covenant and what you are part of. So no man needs to go to your neighbor, hey, you got to keep the commandments. You got to be faithful to the Lord. You won't have to do that anymore during this time period. For everyone will be faithful to the covenant. Everyone will keep the covenant, right?
And that word no, is that yada?
Yes. No is not in Hebrew is not a simple intellectual thing. It's an action. For love. It has many different meanings. But in a covenantal sense, it means to be faithful to the covenant. Okay? The question is, who will know the Lord?
All of Israel.
All of Israel, right? We haven't changed subjects here. All of Israel will know the Lord. All right? Now, next question. Has there ever been a time when all Israel knows the Lord? Has there ever been a time when all Israel knows the Lord? No. That has never happened before. And we just read previously in Jeremiah 31, right? A covenant in which they broke. Because Israel has not been faithful to the covenant. Just look at the book of Judges. Right? They're constantly breaking the covenant. Okay? And now, the last question is, what is the sign of the new covenant then?
Everyone knowing the Lord.
Everyone knowing the Lord, which means what? House of Israel.
Outpouring of the Holy Spirit.
But what does that mean? To know, for everyone to do what? Be faithful to the covenant, right?
To the Mosaic,
To keep the commandments.
to the Mosaic law.
Right. Okay?
Wow.
So it's for everyone so what is the sign of the new covenant? To be faithful to God's commandments. Right. That is the sign of the new covenant. Yes.
But then if that is the sign of the new covenant, then you know, it's like we can't keep it totally. You know, so Yeshua, his blood is what covers it. You know, but we all sin.
Right. Well, I didn't say keep it perfectly. I didn't say every jot and tittle. What I said is to keep his commandments. In other words, within the Torah itself, there's provisions for when you sin to bring a sacrifice of repentance and faith. So the Torah assumes that you're going to break it, but within the Torah itself, you can keep it. Does that make sense?
But so does that mean that if we're believers and we sin, that we're expected to bring a sacrifice?
No, we should ask for forgiveness and repentance and go before the Lord, right? But I'm just saying, within the law itself, you're breaking the Torah, but you're actually keeping the Torah at the same time. That kind of makes sense. Does that make sense? All right, so let's quickly review what we've learned in Jeremiah 31. The new covenant is made with the nation of Israel, not Gentiles. Go ahead.
Could you elaborate quickly? What do you mean by we're breaking it or keeping it?
Well, when we break the covenant, right, or when we sin against God, we can go before Him, and He's made a provision for us within the covenant to ask for forgiveness, which is through sacrificial system. So by doing that, we're actually keeping it. Okay. So what we learned in Jeremiah 31, we learned in the first verse, the new covenant is made with the nation of Israel, not Gentiles. Okay? Not with those outside of Israel. This is exclusive for the nation of Israel. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about that a little later, how Gentiles can being grafted in, things like that. But as far as Jeremiah 31 is concerned, which is, by the way, the only place the word New Covenant is mentioned in the Tanakh. Notice I didn't say Old Covenant, Old Testament. But it is in the Tanakh. It's the only place here. No other place. Go ahead.
What I imagine you're going to keep mentioning nation of Israel. When you say nation of Israel, are you talking about citizens of a piece of land, or are you talking about descendants or something?
The descendants, because it talks about their fathers, right? Not when I covenant I made with their fathers, which are born in Egypt. So in other words, their descendants, those who are descended from Abraham.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
That word new, is that renewed?
Some people say renewed, some people say new, but I think when we get into what is the old and new covenant, you can make that decision for yourself. All right, so the other thing we learned from Jeremiah 31 is the covenant that God made with their fathers is a covenant that they did not keep. All right? I just kind of mentioned that a few moments ago. The other thing is, the sign of the new covenant is having God's law on the heart and all Israel keeping to the covenant. Right? That is a sign of the new covenant, according to Jeremiah 31. And the new covenant, as we have said, has not been fulfilled yet, according to Jeremiah 31, because it's still yet future. And we've already all agreed that if the sign of the new covenant is all Israel keeping the covenant, that has not happened yet, even in our lifetime. Correct? Does everyone see that?
It's the beginning of it, though. It's just not the fulfillment of it yet.
We'll see. All right?
But here,
Yes.
it is being fulfilled. Not all of Israel, but not all of Israel are Israel. But the ones that are Israel through salvation.
Well, the key word is all of Israel keeping the covenant. Not some of Israel, all of Israel. So that has not happened yet.
Okay.
Right? Okay, so that's what we've got over in Jeremiah 31. We're going to return to this later. But I wanted to show you that what I've gotten out of Jeremiah 31, I did not make up. I try to get that from the scriptures, from what Jeremiah actually said. Now, let's go quickly. Where we're going to spend the majority of our time is in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Okay? And real quick, because I forgot to mention this earlier, how many times, and those who don't know the answer, say the answer, but how many times is the phrase Old Covenant used in the scriptures? Does anybody want to take a guess? Anyone want to take a wild guess of how many times the phrase Old Covenant is used?
None.
None. Anybody else? Any guesses? Any more guesses? 10. Okay. Well, we'll find out in a second. All right, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, I didn't put this in your notes. If you're one of those people that tend to forget, you might want to write this down quickly. But it's going to be pretty self-explanatory. There's a color code system for what we're about to see here. Red. Right? Every time you see the words in red, it's in reference to the detractors' qualifications on ministry. right? Detractors are those who are against something or trying to detract from something else. They're a group of false teachers, as we will see, that are against Paul, right? And so Paul mentions them in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and every time they're mentioned or referred to, they will be in red. Does everyone understand that? When Paul talks about his own ministry and qualifications, it will be in purple, right? So red and purple are opposites of each other. Red is bad, purple is good, okay? And two more colors. Green is going to be talking about the glory being veiled. The glory being veiled. And the opposite of that is the glory being unveiled. Right? Again, opposites. Orange and green are opposites. So you'll see them two together. Green is bad, orange is good. We want to remember it that way. Okay, and you'll see how it's pretty self-explanatory as we go through, but I do want to give a quick definition of those colors. All right. And as we go through, I just want to let you know that we're going through the New American Standard. I picked this translation for a particular purpose, as we will see. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about the background and context of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, because before we jump into a passage of Scripture, it's important to know its background and context. All right. First thing is, Paul's ministry was being challenged by outside detractors. Right? People were coming into the congregation of Corinth, and they were saying bad things about Paul. They were saying that he was not truly an apostle. Other things is that he didn't have the correct qualifications. And so that is the context what 2 Corinthians 3 is addressing. Okay, that's very important, as we will see. The other thing is, what the detractors were saying is that Paul had no authority or credentials. Possible some people theorize that he was not truly ordained as a rabbi, or he did not truly walk with the Messiah, wasn't originally one of the 12 disciples, things like that. But whatever the case may be, they were saying that he was not truly a leader within the church. And so that's what some of the things that they were saying. Another thing is, Paul's response, as we will see, was to ask the Corinthians to consider what he had done through his ministry. Rather than Paul defend himself, he simply asked the Corinthians, look, what have I done among you to show my qualifications among you? And that's basically how he's going to answer the charge. And he answered the charge with saying, you yourself are my credentials. Right? That's what he's going to say. And then Paul is going to compare his ministry with Moses' ministry. Okay? So he's going to compare and contrast between his ministry and Moses' ministry, as we will see. Alright. So moving on. So we're going to start right at the end of chapter 2, leading into chapter 3, so we got a good context. So it says, but thanks be to God, who always leads us in triumph in the Messiah, and manifests through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of Him in every place. For we are a fragrance of Messiah to God among those who are being saved and to those who are perishing. Okay? So he's saying that his ministry is a sweet aroma, a fragrance of the Messiah among those who are saved, among those who are perishing. And what is that aroma? To the one, an aroma of death leading to death, and to the other, aroma of life leading to life. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and put this in a nice little picture for you to kind of understand what Paul is saying here. And don't write this down, because we're going to see this again later. So Paul's ministry, he says, manifests a fragrance and aroma of Messiah. Right? And to those that are perishing to death, he says, it leads to death. Right? It smells of death. But to those who are saved unto life, they smell life. It leads unto life. Does everyone see that? Okay. So, and here's a key question for your notes, is Paul's ministry invoked both life or death depending on the condition of the heart of the person who listened. Does everyone see that? The condition of the heart. If your heart was not towards God, you smelt death. You sensed death among Paul. But if your life was towards God, you smell life. Okay? That's what Paul is essentially saying. And then he asks a very important question. And this is the most key question in this chapter. And who is adequate for these things? What things are we referring to? Being a fragrance and aroma of Messiah. Who is adequate for these things? Okay? This is the key question of this passage. Okay. Like I said, I'm moving kind of fast. If I go too fast, just let me know. All right. So let's go ahead and break into chapter 3 here. For we are not like many peddling the word of God, but as from sincerity. But as from God, we speak in the Messiah in the sight of God. So everyone see the red as he's referring to his detractors, and he's speaking of himself in purple. Does everyone see that? Okay. So his detractors were peddling the word of God, right? But he is saying that he is from sincerity, and he's speaking of the Messiah in the sight of God. And then he goes on to say, at the beginning of chapter 3, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some, letters of commendation to you or from you? Right? So in other words, he's saying, do I need a letter to show you that I truly am qualified for this ministry? As some of my other detractors that say they got some so-called letter from other men that say that they're qualified? Is that what I really need? And so he goes on to say, you are our letter, meaning the congregation, you are our letter of commendation, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are a letter of commendation from the Messiah, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, written not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of fleshly hearts. Such confidence we have through the Messiah towards God, not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider as anything coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, as you can see a contrast of red and purple here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the red and purple here, I'm going to put a nice little chart and organize it for us, excuse me, to help better picture what Paul is saying here, okay? So and again, you don't have to write this down, it's not as important, but the detractors' ministry versus Paul's ministry. Here, on one side, the detractors, he says, they have a letter written in ink, right? Or on tablets of stone. Now, when we think of tablets of stone, what do we immediately think of? The Ten Commandments, right? Keep that in mind. Written with ink on tablets of stone, adequate in oneself, coming from oneself, right? And then at the end he says, it is of the letter. It is of the letter. I'll be sure to get a worksheet. Okay? On Paul's ministry side, he says, his is not of ink, but his is of the Spirit. Right? On tablets of fleshly hearts. And his adequacy is from God. Because why? God made him servants of what? The new covenant. And he's not of the letter, but he's of the Spirit. Does everyone see that? It's a direct dichotomy. You got one side and the other side. And so what we see here is, we see a direct versus mentality. One side and the other side. But there's something missing here. What do you suppose is missing? What do you suppose is missing? The Old Covenant. Now, Paul didn't say Old Covenant, but if we're going to be consistent with what he's saying over here, that would seem to fit the case, right? Okay. All right. So Paul will use these qualifications of ministries as an opportunity to teach the difference between Moses' ministry and his ministry later on. Okay? And we've already kind of seen a hint on tablets of stone. All right? So let's look at something a little more carefully that we need to look into a little more. Is what he says here, I believe it's verse 6. It says, servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, and the Spirit gives life. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, let's find out. Here Paul says that the new covenant ministry is not of the letter, but of the Spirit. But what does that mean? By looking at other places in Paul's letters where he contrasts letter and the Spirit, will give us a proper understanding of what he means here. So Paul does not go into the detail at the moment of letter and Spirit, but he does in other places. And so we're going to go there real briefly to see if we can glean from him what he means by letter and spirit. Okay? And there's only two other places where he does this. Alright? And the first place he does it is in Romans 2, 26 through 29. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and read it. And look at the screen as I read it, because you'll see some interesting things. So if the uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you who through having the letter of the law and outward circumcision are a transgressor of the law? Right? So, letter of the law and circumcision, or outward circumcision, go together. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, not by the Spirit, not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God. So we have spirit and letter here contrasted. Everyone see that? Okay, we're going to go over that in a second. Let's look at the other place where he mentions letter and spirit, and that is in Romans 7, 4 through 6. Therefore, my brethren, you also were made to die to the condemnation of the law through the body of Messiah, so that you might be joined to another, to him who is raised from the dead, in order that you what? That you might bear fruit to God. For while you were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in our members of our body to bear fruit to death. But now that we have been raised from the condemnation of the law, released from the condemnation of the law, having died to that which we were bound, so that we serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. Okay? So here's contrasting letter and spirit in this context of bearing fruit to God and bearing fruit to death. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm going to put this in a nice chart for us so we can kind of understand what it's saying. So what is the conclusion of Paul's use of letter and spirit here? What can we learn from those other two passages in Romans? Right? Okay, so we saw in Romans chapter 2 that the letter corresponds to outwardly or fleshly circumcised, something that's outward from us, and the spirit is referring to inwardly, heart circumcised. Right? Where we've heard heart before. The letter refers to in the flesh. The spirit refers to being joined to Messiah. The letter refers to bearing fruit to death, and the spirit refers to bearing fruit for God. The letter refers to serve in oldness. The spirit refers to serve in newness. Okay? So basically what I did is I took those concepts we saw in Romans 2 and Romans 7, and I put them in this chart here. So here one can conclude that the letter and spirit correspond to the condition of one's heart, of the life before faith, meaning the letter, and the life after faith, referring to the spirit. Okay? Or what we can say previously in our discussions, the life after the fall and life after the regeneration. All right, so does everyone see how I contrast letter and spirit there? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the verse again, what Paul says. Servants of a new covenant, right? Not of the letter, but of the spirit, for the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. All right? So let's put this back with the chart we saw earlier at chapter 2. So we got Paul's ministry manifest, the fragrance and aroma of Messiah. To those perishing to death, they are of the what? They are of the letter. And they leads to death, right? For the letter kills, death. And those who are saved to life, they are of the Spirit, and it leads to life. And so again, we're going to bring up our question, that's the key question of the passages. And who is adequate for these things? Who is adequate for this ministry to lead those to death and lead those to life? All right, Paul's going to explain it to us in the very next section. So in 2 Corinthians 3, 6 through 9, it says, servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. But of the ministry of death, and letters engraved on stones. And what is that? The 10 Commandments. Did Paul just say that the Ten Commandments is a ministry of death? Is that what he just said? Is that what he said, or is that just me? That's what he said, right? So I guess we don't need to keep the Ten Commandments because, hey, I don't want to be a part of a ministry of death. Do you? That's what he says. What does he mean? But if the ministry of death and letters engraved on stones came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face, fading as it was, how will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. Okay. Well, he says some very interesting things, so let's break it down, and so we can get a good understanding of what he's saying. So let's say the letter kills, right? We saw that, and the letter kills is equal to what? The ministry of death, right? Letter kills, but if the ministry of death, okay, they're kind of the same thing. And where is the ministry of death at? Where's the ministry of death? What does he say? He says, it is letters engraved on stones, right? That's what he said. And what else is the ministry of death and letter kills is also referring to the ministry of condemnation. Does everyone see that? Letter kills, ministry of death, ministry of condemnation. They're all the same thing. He's referring to the same thing. He repeats himself 3 times so we can get the point, right? All right, so let's look at the other side. The Spirit gives life. And what is that reference to? The ministry of the Spirit. Everyone see that? Yeah? Okay. Now he doesn't mention it here, but where's the ministry of the Spirit at? It is written on the heart. Good. You guys are listening. Right? And what is that? And what is that also parallel to in this verse? Ministry of righteousness. So here, again, we see a direct dichotomy. Killing and life. Engraved in stones, written on the heart. Okay? So what does this mean? Well, we have to ask ourselves 3 important questions, and we're going to go through each important question, okay? The first question that we should really ask ourselves is, what event is Paul referring to when Israel could not look at Moses' face because of its glory? What event is he referring to? Because he says, it came with glory so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at Moses' face. He's talking about that, so we're going to look at that in a second, right? So that's the event. And the next question we should ask ourselves is, when did the glory fade? Because it says fading as it was. So when did it fade? Well, that's a good question. We're going to find out in a second. The other question is, when is the glory that... so what is this glory? It's supposed to be what? What is this glory that Paul is referring to? Okay, what is this glory? He keeps talking about the glory. What is it? Well, we're going to talk about that as well. So let's go ahead and look at the first question. All right? When could Israel not look at the face of Moses? And you guys already answered it. In Exodus 34, 29 to 31. Okay? Let's go ahead and read it real quick. It came about when Moses was coming down from the mountain, Sinai, and the 2 tablets of testimony were in his hand as he was coming down from the mountain, which is letters engraved on stone. Right? There it is for us, letters engraved on stone. That Moses did not know that his skin of his face shone because he was speaking with the Lord. So when Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses, behold, his skin of his face shone, they were afraid to come near to him. Right? So they see this guy, he's glowing, right, like a nightlight, and they're afraid of him. Okay? And so they're afraid. And so what does Moses do? No, that's not what he does. That's not what he does, and that's why I want to emphasize this point. Then Moses called to them, and Moses and Aaron and all the rules of the congregation returned to them, and Moses spoke with them. So they were initially afraid. He spoke to them. Oh, it's Moses. We're good. Right? Well, let's keep reading. Afterward, all the sons of Israel came near. Now we have all the sons of Israel coming near. They're not afraid. And Moses commanded them to do everything that the Lord had spoken to them on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a what? A veil over his face. Don't forget that. Okay? But whenever Moses went before the Lord to speak with him, he would do what? take the veil off, right? Take off the veil until he came out. And whenever he came out to speak to the sons of Israel, what he had been commanded, the sons of Israel would see the face of Moses, that is, the skin of Moses' face shown, so Moses would replace the veil over his face until he went to speak before the Lord. All right? So that's it. That's where the chapter ends, and he moves on to something else, and talk about the veil ever again. Okay? So that's it. That's the account that he's referring to in Exodus 34. All right. So let's see what we've learned in Exodus 34. What have we learned from Exodus 34? The first thing we've learned is that an explicit reason for the veil is not given. There's nothing in Exodus 34 that says Moses put the veil on because of this. Nothing says there. Doesn't tell us why. Right? He doesn't tell us why. The other thing that we've seen in Exodus 34 is that the people's fear is not overcome by Moses wearing the veil, but by him talking with them before he ever put the veil on. And I want to emphasize that because every time I talk to somebody about this chapter, the reason why I put the veil on is because they were afraid. No, that's not why he put the veil on. Right? And we had somebody mention that earlier. And that's not the case. It doesn't tell us why. And the other thing we learned is that after Moses would talk to the people and they see the glory of his face, he would put the veil on. But when he would talk to the Lord, he would take the veil off. On and off, on and off, right? Okay. So here we have Moses. He comes out of the tent of meeting and there's no veil. He talks to people, tells them the commandments. He puts the veil on. And then he goes in, talks to the Lord. He takes the veil off. Does everyone see that? And comes out again, talks to people, puts the veil on. Okay. Nothing indicates, and this is what we saw, nothing indicates that the glory of Moses' face was fading. Does everyone agree with that? There was nothing in there that talks about Moses' face was fading. Right? Okay. So if that's the case, and that is true, why then did Moses say the glory was fading? From the rabbis? Where did he get that from? Well, we're going to find it here in a second. It brings us to our next question. When did the glory fade? When did the glory fade? Well, let's look a little closer at the Greek. The Greek word for to fade is kartageto. All right? It is found 27 times in the apostolic scriptures, 25 which of them are Pauline. So the majority of them are Pauline. So he uses that word at least 25 times. Right? In every case, the word means to abolish, to annul, to make ineffective, to bring to glory, to bring to nothing. Right? In every case. That's what it means. It never means to fade. Never means to fade. And this is why, unfortunately, I was a little disappointed with the new Messianic translation that came out. It also translated to fade. Because that's not what it means. And it changes the whole connotation of the passage, as we will see here in a moment. Okay? It does not mean to fade. However, the New King James, the King James and some other translations translate it correctly. Right? But it does not mean to fade, as we will see here in a moment. Now, this word is used, kartageto, right? Which means to abolish or make it effective. It is used in this chapter in verses 7, 11, 13, and 14. So he uses it 4 times in one chapter. And this is the chapter he uses it in. Right? And we're going to look at each one. Alright, it is used in the present tense, not the past tense. And when we look at it translated, they translate it for some reason in the past tense, even though it is in the Greek, it is present tense. And that changes the meaning of the passage as well. Okay? And the last thing is, as we will see, Paul's use of the kartageto is to describe the veil's purpose and function. The kartageto is describing the veil's purpose and function. That is very important. Very, very important in this passage. And we're going to be going over that over and over again to make sure we understand that the kartageto is referring to the veil's purpose and function. Alright, so let's go back to now that we've learned and had a good background of the passage, let's go back to the passage and let's make some changes. All right? So here we go. Servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. But if the ministry of death and letters engraved on stones came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face fading as it was. Well, we know it's not fading as it was, right? So let's cross that out. What is it? They could not look at Moses' face, the glory of his face. Why? Because it was being made ineffective. Present tense. It was being made ineffective, right? And the question is, how is the glory made ineffective in Exodus 34? It is the...
Okay.
It is the what?
The veil.
The veil. That's exactly right. So they could not look at intently at the face of Moses because the glory of his face is made ineffective by the veil. Does everyone see that? Right? We got that from Exodus 34, the same event he's referring to. Right? How will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. Okay? We'll cover that back in a second. Let's go to the next verse, 10 and 11. For indeed, what had glory, in this case, has no glory, because of the glory that surpassed it. For if that which fades away, well, fades away is not a proper translation. What should it say? For if that which is made ineffective, and how is it made ineffective? By the veil. For if that which is made ineffective by the veil, not was, but is with glory, right? Much more that which remains is in glory. Okay? Do you understand how this whole changes the whole connotation of the passage? Okay. So it's not fading, it is being made ineffective by the veil. Now, Paul did not mention the veil, unfortunately, here, but he will later. So I'm not trying to add to scriptures, I'm trying to give the whole context of everything. Okay? So here we see that the purpose and function of a veil is to hide or make ineffective the what? The glory. Right? That's the purpose and function of the veil, which we'll see here in a second. Alright, so let's go ahead and put this in a chart, and this is at the back of your sheet here. Okay, this chart I'm about to show you. Let's review what we've learned. Alright? The ministry of death and condemnation, which he had mentioned earlier in verse 6 and 7, right? Is letters engraved on stones, which you make reference in verse 7. Everyone remember that? So the ministry of death and condemnation is letters engraved on stones, which makes reference to what? The Ten Commandments on the stone, right? Okay. Paul says it came with glory, but they could not look intently at that glory, which he said in verse 7, right? And why could they not look intently at that glory? The glory is made effective and hidden by the veil. Okay? Does everyone see that? Okay. Like I said, I'm moving kind of fast, so I don't want to go too fast. But the glory is made ineffective by the veil. Okay, so let's look at the flip side of it. All right, we got the ministry of the Spirit and righteousness is written with what? Written on letters of fleshly hearts, what she said in verse 3. Okay? And Paul says that it abounds more in glory. It abounds more in glory. And if that abounds more in glory, it remains and surpasses in glory, which is said in verses 8 and 11. Now, does anyone want to take a guess of why the ministry of Spirit and righteousness surpasses and remains in glory? Because there is no veil. Exactly. Does everyone see the dichotomy here? All right. I'm making it painfully clear because hopefully we'll forget it later on. Okay? So let's look at another example of the glory and the veil. Okay? So we have the ministry of death and condemnation. Okay? Now, I'm using the illustration of a flashlight to be the source of the glory. Okay? And Paul says that the ministry of death and condemnation had the veil, right? So here's a picture of the veil. So when the glory shines, they can't see it. He's sad because he can't see the glory. And why can't you see the glory? Because the glory is hidden. Because there's a veil there, right? So Paul says the ministry of death and condemnation has glory, but it is made ineffective by the veil. That is correct. So let's look at the ministry of the Spirit of righteousness, right? Here we have the same flashlight, and when you turn on the flashlight of the glory, what happens? They're happy. And why are they happy? Because the glory is seen. Does everyone see that? Okay. So the ministry of the ministry of Spirit and righteousness surpasses and bounds in glory. Why? Because there's no veil. There is no veil. Okay. Does everyone get that? Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So let's move on to verses 12 to 13 in 2 Corinthians. Therefore, now he's saying therefore, because he's concluding what he just said, right? Therefore, having such hope, we use great boldness in our speech and are not like Moses. So he's comparing his ministry with Moses' ministry, right? He's saying he is not like Moses. And how is he not like Moses? Because Moses used to put a what? Veil on his face. So now he's mentioning the veil. Okay, so I have not been adding to the scriptures. That's what his intention is all along. Because Moses used to put a veil on his face for the purpose so that the sons of Israel will not look intently at the end of that which is faded away. What? That which is made ineffective by the veil. Everyone see how that makes a lot more sense? Okay. So let's look at this word end here. What does he mean that the sons of Israel cannot look intently at the end of that which is made ineffective by the veil? What does that mean, end? Well, again, I would say that's a poor translation of the Greek. The Greek word for end is teleos. It is better understood and translated as goal, aim, or purpose. Okay? It is better understood that way. Okay? And teleos is where we get the word telephone, right? Just trying to get a hold of the other end, the goal, right? Okay? So we shouldn't say that the sons of Israel will not look intently at not the end, but at the goal of what was made ineffective by the veil. Everyone see that? Okay, good. We're making good time. So they could not look at the goal of what was made ineffective by the veil. So what is this goal? So let's compare verses 7 and 13 because, as a matter of fact, they are parallel verses, as we will see. So here I kind of put it in color so we can see the parallel here. In verse 7 it says, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face is made ineffective by the veil. Okay? But in verse 13 it says, Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, so that the sons of Israel will not look intently at the goal of which is made ineffective by the veil. Okay? So what is the parallel? That the glory equals the goal. Right? The glory equals the goal. In other words, the glory and goal are the same thing. So the goal is seeing the glory. And we haven't discussed what the glory is. But we will in a minute. Does everyone see the parallel there? Does anybody have any questions of seeing the parallel between the two? Okay. So I'm saying that the glory of his face and at the goal are the same thing. Okay? And what do the glory and goal have in common? Right? What do they have in common? They are both hidden by the veil. Does everyone see that? They're both hidden by the veil. Okay. So let's move on to verse 14. And this will be definitely, hopefully, some of the answers will be coming together in these next two verses. Alright? So he goes on to say, but if their minds were hardened, but if their minds were hardened or made like stone, for until this very day, at the reading of the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted because it is removed in Messiah. Okay? Alright. So we're going to let's look at this verse here in a minute. So, by the way, that word removed there is kartageto. So, but that's translated abolished or made ineffective, right? So, it is made ineffective. And the question is, what is the it there? What is the it? All right. Well, before we do, by the way, this is the only place that the phrase Old Covenant is used in the Scripture. In all 66 books, this is the only place the word Old Covenant is used. Now, a lot of emphasis is made on the word Old Covenant, is it not? And this is the only place used only one time? So I guess we better understand what Paul means by Old Covenant, right? When he says Old Covenant. So the question is, why were their minds hardened? According to verse 14, why were their minds hardened? Does anybody want to take a stab at it? Why are their minds hardened?
Because the veil still remains.
Because what?
The veil still remains.
The veil remains unlifted. Right? Okay, good. And what is abolished in the Messiah? Now, before we answer, let's look at some more traditional answers that people give of what is abolished in Messiah. Right? Some people say, well, the law is abolished in Messiah, right? That's what Paul means here? It is abolished in Messiah? Nope, that's not what Paul means. The law is abolished in Messiah. Doesn't mention the law here. At least not directly. Well, it's obviously the covenant that's abolished, right? God abolished the covenant. Is that what the it is abolished in Messiah? Nope, that's not the covenant. Here's another one. Is it the glory that's abolished in Messiah?
No.
Nope, doesn't mention the glory. So what is abolished in Messiah?
The veil.
It is the veil. That is so important. It is not the law, it's not the covenant, it's not the glory. It is the veil that's abolished. Now what is the purpose and function of the veil? It is to hide the glory. Right? Alright, so let's move on. We'll kind of come back to this later. So it is because the veil is removed in Messiah, or abolished in Messiah. So let's go to verses 15 and 16 real quick before we go back. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over the heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away from the heart. Right? Okay. So, why does Paul say Moses here? Now, let's not forget. Remember, Moses is the one who put the veil over his face so that the people cannot look intently at the glory and gold, right? Remember what he says in verse 7? Right? So, Moses stands for putting the veil over your face. So, let's go ahead and read the passage again. Sorry, I forgot this. Reading the law. Reading the law and the veil, rendering the glory hidden and ineffective. What he says in verse 13, which is just 3 verses ago. So let's go ahead and read again. But to this very day, whenever Moses is read, with the glory hidden, okay, right? A veil lies over their heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away from the heart. Okay? Does that make a little more sense? Okay. So let's go ahead and look at verses 14 and 15 and 16. And the reason why I want to do that is because they're parallel verses. Paul is just repeating himself in the same way as he did before, but in a different way. And Paul does it a lot. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at the parallel here. We have verse 14 on the left side and verse 14 and 15 on the right side. So Paul says in verse 14, their minds were hardened. The same veil remains unlifted. Notice he said the word same veil. Okay, he's not talking about a physical thing, right? Doesn't make any sense. But in verse 15 and 16 he says, a veil lies over the heart. Parallel, right? Okay, let's look at another one. Until this very day. And verse 15 and 16 he says, but to this day. Okay? And later he says, because the veil is removed in Messiah, and verse 15 and 16 he says, whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now, does everyone see the parallelism so far in these these 3 verses? Does everyone see that? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. All right. So, what is missing here? In verse 15 and 16 he says, whenever Moses is read. Whenever Moses is read. Well, what is Moses? that we said Moses was. Moses' face veiled, hiding the glory. Right? That's what we said Moses' face was. So what should be in this box? At the reading of the Old Covenant. So what is the Old Covenant, according to Paul in this passage? The Old Covenant is Moses' face veiled, hiding the glory. That is what the Old Covenant is. Now, what does that mean?
How do you read Moses' face?
Well, it's not, you can't because it's covered, right?
Whenever Moses is read, I think it's
Well,
also be talking about
a veil on the heart. Right? He says, whenever Moses is read, they have a veil on their heart. What is the veil doing on the heart? It's preventing the heart from seeing the glory. Does that make sense? The veil is preventing the glory from being shined on the heart. So when he says whenever at the reading of the Old Covenant, when you're reading the law without seeing the glory. Go ahead.
Was the question to that, like, Moses the person?
I was just saying, if you read the law without faith, the veil is because there's no faith.
Right.
But as soon as you have the faith, then you don't have the veil.
Then the veil is taken
The
away.
covenant in itself doesn't include the law itself. When Moses is read with the veil, that's without the faith.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to. I mean, the Old Covenant isn't just the veil, or else you couldn't read the veil.
No, I didn't say the Old Covenant was the veil. That's not what I said. What I said is the Old Covenant is Moses' face veiled, hiding the glory. In other words, not able to see. So in other words, when you open up the Tanakh, and you open up the Exodus, and you start reading it, you're unable to see the glory that's really in the Torah. Why? Because it's veiled. You can't see the glory. Because it's veiled. There's a veil over your heart. And what is the heart again? Making decisions, seeing things, right? All right. So the question is, and we're going to go into more what the Old Covenant is as we develop into the chapter. Why does Paul say it is an old covenant? Why does he use the word old? And again, by the way, I'm a little disappointed in the new translation because it says ancient covenant. It's not an ancient covenant, it's an old covenant. That's what the word means. Okay? So why does Paul say it's an old covenant? Well, let's go ahead and look at that. All right? Paul's use of the word old. Every time, and I emphasize this, every single time Paul uses the word old, right? I got the Greek word there. In his letters, he always is describing the life of a person before faith, or should I say, after the fall. Right? A life of sin and rebellion that leads to death and condemnation. Right? So whenever he references the word old, it's always in reference to the life of sin and rebellion and death and condemnation. Alright, so let's look at every single passage that he does that, just to prove my point. Okay? I have them listed there for you in your sheets. In Ephesians 4, 22 to 24, it says, in reference to your former manner of life, you will lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you are renewed in the spirit of your mind and put to death the new self. Old self, new self, which is in the likeness of God and has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. Does everyone see that? Old is referring to your before faith and after faith. Okay. Let's look at another passage. In Colossians 3, 9 through 10, it says, do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. Right? Old and new. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, in order that the body of sin might be done away, so that we will no longer be slaves to sin. Right? So the old self is referring to being slaves to sin. Everyone see that? Alright. Look at another one. 1 Corinthians 5, 7 through 8. Clean, and we should all be familiar with this one since we just experienced it. Clean out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Messiah our Passover has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Okay? Let's look at another one. Two more. Therefore, if anyone is in Messiah, he is a new creature. The old things passed away. Behold, new things have come. Old and new again. Again, referring to the life before faith and the life after faith. And of course, we should all be familiar with this next verse. But now we have been released from the condemnation of the law, having died to that which we're bound, so we serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. And where have we seen that before? For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. You see that? All comes full circle. Old and new, letter and Spirit. All right? Does anybody have any questions on that? Pretty self-explanatory. All right, so what's my point? Well, let's continue on. What is the Old Covenant then? What is it? According to Paul. And again, we're not done with the chapter yet. We're going to look more into the chapter to further prove my point. The Old Covenant is reading the law veiled, right? Unable to see the glory and goal of the law. Right? The letters written on stone and not written on the heart. There we have the Mosaic Law, right? The Ten Commandments written on stone. It's written on stone, it's outside the person, right? But if those exact same letters are written in the heart, right, has an effect on you, which we'll see in a second. Trying to keep the covenant, the Old Covenant is trying to keep the covenant by one's own strength apart from faith and the Spirit, right? So if somebody is part of the Mosaic Covenant and they're trying to keep the Torah, okay, apart from faith, they're just trying, I got to do this, 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 I got to do this to please God. They're part of the Old Covenant because they're not doing it with faith in God and they're not doing it with the Spirit of God. Right? The Old Covenant is reading the law, having one's heart and mind made like stone, or having a hardened heart. Right? Not having a heart of flesh. Now, just for clarification, the old man or the old self is not the Old Covenant. The old man is not the Old Covenant. What it is when you're the old man, it turns into the Old Covenant for you because you're doing it by your own strength. Okay, just want to clarify that. So, the same letters that are written on stone are written on the heart. The same letters that are written on stone, which have no effect, which bring forth death, right? When those exact same letters are written on the heart by the Spirit, they have a life-giving effect. Right? There are not two different laws. There's not one law for them back then and one law for us today. It's the same law, just one is written on stone and one is written on the heart. Does everyone see that? So the Old Covenant is written on stone, the New Covenant is written on the heart. The same covenant, though. Alright, so moving on to the passage. Hopefully it'll become a little more clear. Whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away from the heart. Now, the Lord is the Spirit, and wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. This is where we talked about it in the triune nature of God class. I kind of brought up the Lord as the Spirit, right? Literally what that means is the Lord is that Spirit. Right? And then meaning the Spirit that takes away the law from our heart, the veil from our heart, excuse me. Now, he says, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Ah, liberty. Liberty to do whatever I want, right? No. Liberty, freedom to eat whatever I want, right? Liberty to go wherever, whenever I want. Referring to the Sabbath, right? No. What does it mean to have liberty in the Spirit? In John 8:34-36, Yeshua answered them, "Truly, truly, I say unto you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. So if the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. Free from what? Free from sin, right? So what does it mean to have liberty in the Spirit? It means to be free. To be free in the Spirit is to be from sin and condemnation, so that we can have the ability to do the Lord's will. Remember last week? The man after the fall that does not have the ability to please God, but the man after regeneration does. Right? Why? Because he has the Spirit of God. There's liberty in the Spirit of God. There's liberty from sin and death. Everyone see that? So let's moving on to passage verse 17. But with we, referring to who? The apostle, his ministry. But with we all, with unveiled faces. Now we have unveiled face, right? Not like Moses who put a veil over his face. But with we, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. So that's our answer to our third question. What is the glory that Paul is referring to this whole time? What is the glory? The glory of what? The glory of the Lord, right? So, what did Paul say earlier? He said the ministry of death came with glory. It came with the glory of the Lord. But it was made ineffective because of the veil. Right? The glory of the Lord are being transformed in the same image from glory to glory, just as the Lord, the Spirit. So here Paul tells us plainly what is the glory, what this glory he has been referring to, the glory of the Messiah, who is the very goal of the Torah, the law. Right? Because what does Paul say in Romans 10:4? For Messiah is the goal of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes. That's why they were unable to see the goal of the law. Why? Because the veil was there. That's what Paul says. Right? In verse 13. But so Messiah is the glory of the law. He is the goal of the law as well. Right? Does everyone see that? So let's go ahead and review. Alright? Let's review what we've learned so far. So he says the ministry of death and condemnation is letters engraved on stones. Right? Referring to Moses' ministry. Right? It came with glory of the Messiah, but they could not look intently at his glory. And why couldn't they look intently at his glory? The glory of Messiah is made ineffective and hidden by the veil. And that is the ministry of death and condemnation. And so on the flip side, the ministry of the Spirit and righteousness is letters written on fleshly hearts. It abounds more in the glory of Messiah. Why? The glory of Messiah remains and surpasses in glory because the veil is abolished. Right. Does everyone see that? All right. So let's go back. And you might want to write this down. This is the final review for that we saw at the very beginning of end of chapter 2. So we have Paul's ministry manifest the fragrance and aroma of Messiah. Those perishing to death have the letters written on stone and the glory veiled. And those people that are perishing to death and have the glory veiled are part of the old covenant or of the letter. And what is the result of them? The result is death. But those saved to life, right, have the letters on fleshly hearts by the Spirit, and the glory is unveiled. And because they're saved to life and have the glory unveiled, they are part of the new covenant, or of the Spirit. And of course that leads to life. So now that Paul has explained this, he's compared his ministry with Moses' ministry, we need to not forget the key question of the passage, and who is adequate for these things. So now he's going to go back. Now he's going to go back to his original assumption. What he was originally talking about at the end of chapter 2, and talk about his ministry. Right? At the beginning of chapter 4. So Paul now returns to his main point, the comparison of the detractor's ministry and his ministry. So now he says, therefore. So now, again, he's concluding from therefore again. Therefore, since we have this new covenant ministry, as we have received mercy, we do not lose heart. But we have renounced the things hidden because of shame, not walking in craftiness or adulterating the word of God, but by manifestation of truth, commending ourselves and to every man's conscience in the sight of God. He mentions man's conscience at the end of chapter 2. So now he's going back to compare his ministry, okay? Goes on. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. So now what have we seen so far? We've seen that Moses is veiled, right? We saw that the goal and glory is veiled. And now what does Paul say? That the gospel is veiled. Does everyone see the connection there? The veil, the veil, the veil. And so what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that the Messiah is veiled. Right? And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who is perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of the Messiah, who is the image of God. And so there he mentions again the glory of the Messiah, right? Is the light of the gospel. They are unable to see the light of the gospel because of why? Well, he says the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, which equals to what? Equals to the veil. They are not able to see the glory of the gospel. They're not able to see the Messiah in the Scriptures because they have a veil over their heart. And how is that veil removed? It is removed when the Spirit of God changes your heart. You can't do it on your own. The Spirit of God must first remove the veil. He must first write His Torah on your heart in order for you to believe in Him and repent. Okay? Finishing off. For we do not preach ourselves as His detractors did, but we preach Messiah Yeshua as Lord, and ourselves as your bondservants for Yeshua's sake. For God, who said, light shall shine out of the darkness, is the one who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Messiah. And what is the glory of the Messiah? The glory of God. Which makes reference to, again, Yeshua being deity. But we have this treasure of earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of the power of God will be of God and not of ourselves. Now, this is what we call a bookend, and it's common in the Scriptures. They have a bookend, and this corresponds to 2 Corinthians chapter 3 of 5 through 6, as we will see. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to be considered anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who has made us adequate of the servants of the new covenant. And so we see adequate of ourselves, and he says adequate of ourselves. Everyone see that? And he says, we are of God, he is from God. So he's doing a bookend here to round off what he's been trying to communicate this whole time. Okay? So let's contrast the two covenants. So within the Mosaic covenant, you might want to write this down. Within the Mosaic covenant, right? Within the Mosaic covenant, there are two covenants within one covenant. Now, what do I mean? Well, if you're in the Mosaic covenant, and you those who that have the glory of Messiah hidden by the veil and do not believe, right? You have those in the Mosaic covenant that do not believe. Okay? And you have those in the Mosaic covenant that do believe. Those that have the veil removed in order to see the glory of Messiah and do believe. Okay? So you have two groups of people within the Mosaic covenant. And so if you do not believe, guess what? You're part of the old covenant. And if you do believe, guess what? You're part of the new covenant. So if you believe in the Messiah, if you have seen the glory of the Messiah in the gospel and in the Torah, then you are part of the new covenant. And if for those who have not seen the Messiah, have not seen the glory of the gospel, are part of the old covenant, that are part of the Mosaic covenant. Right? So let's real quick look at this. So the old covenant is letters written on stone. The new covenant is letters written on the heart. So real quickly, and if you don't have time to write this down, I'll show it later, but the old covenant is letters written on stone. The new covenant is letters written on the heart. It is the glory in gold veiled. It is the glory in gold seen. It is the heart of stone. The new covenant is the heart of flesh. The old covenant is as a slave and condemnation. The new covenant is freedom and righteousness. The old covenant is the gospel or the Messiah veiled. The new covenant is the gospel and Messiah seen. The old covenant results in death, the curses of the law. The new covenant results in life, the blessings of the law. The blessings and cursings of the law, remember that? The life without faith is the old covenant. The life with faith is the new covenant. The letter of the law is the old covenant. The spirit of the law is the new covenant. All right. So this conclusion, what have we concluded from Jeremiah 31 and 2 Corinthians chapter 3? In Jeremiah 31 to 34, we saw that the new covenant is referring to a future time when God will change the whole nation of Israel by writing His law on their heart. At that time, all Israel will be saved. And by the way, that's still future to us, right? That's what, according to Jeremiah 31, that's still future to us. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, we saw that the new covenant is referring to a past and present time, right? When God changes individuals by writing His law on their heart. This is when they are given the gift of faith and are saved, right? So let me ask you this: to put what we put to application what we've been learning tonight. Was Abraham part of the new covenant? Yes. Was David part of the new covenant? Yes. So the new and old covenant is not a time-bound thing. It's not before Yeshua and after Yeshua. That's not the old new covenant. New covenant has to do with the change of your heart.
And Moses was no covenant.
Well, Moses himself was probably part of the new covenant, yes, because he had faith in God. Right? So it is not the scriptures on this side over here. It is not the scriptures on this side over here that makes the old new covenant. Right? It is a change of heart. So we see individual believers, right, or the remnant, as somebody had said earlier, leads to what? Leads to, or is a down payment, or shows in the future the salvation of all Israel, right? It shows that God is going to be faithful to Israel in the future. Why? By saving individual believers today, both Jews and Gentiles, right? And where have we seen that in the Feast of Israel? We've seen that in the Feast of Israel, even what we're practicing today, is because the individual believers are the first fruits of the harvest. We here in this room are the first fruits, the guarantee that God will save Israel in the future. And what is Israel? Israel is the final harvest. The fulfillment of the new covenant, when God will draw His people to Himself, right? Does everyone see that?
Yeah, isn't Paul referred to first fruits
Yes,
in the Testament?
it does. Go ahead.
You said, like, for the Mosaic covenant, there's two covenants within the covenant.
That's right.
This is the old covenant and the new covenant.
That's correct.
Now, there was a scenario in Deuteronomy chapter 5 when Moses explained the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
He said, Moses said to the people, the Lord
Can you speak a little louder so we're going to hear you?
Okay. Moses said to the people, the Lord God made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us. So who's referring to as fathers? He's talking about Abraham, Isaac,
No, he's
Jacob?
referring to those who came out of Egypt that died in the desert. So what is he making reference to is that really what we should understand is that he did not only make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, because he's entering into the land. He's renewing. Deuteronomy is a renewed covenant right before they enter the land, right? So he's saying this covenant, this renewed covenant I'm making with you, is not the covenant I made with your fathers when I brought them out of Egypt. I'm making it with you because why? You guys are entering into the land, right? And so that's how the book of Deuteronomy starts, because that's why Deuteronomy repeats everything in the previous books. It just kind of repeats everything. It's renewing the covenant before they enter the land. That's what he's referring to. So let's real quick. Let's look at our final verse. It's written on the bottom of your sheets. And I think this is kind of fitting, and it kind of sums up what we learned tonight. Ezekiel 36, 24 through 28. It says, "For I will take you, Israel, from the nations, gather you from all the lands, and bring you into your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes. And you will be careful to observe my ordinances. You will live in the land that I gave to your forefathers, so you will be my people, and I will be your God." Okay. The word "new" there, spirit is there, right? And somebody last week came up to me and asked me, well, when Yeshua was talking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, he talked about being born of water and born of spirit. And he was surprised that Nicodemus didn't already know this. Right? So where in the scriptures does it talk about being born of water and spirit? Well, right here. "I will sprinkle clean water in you, and you will be clean. I will give you a new spirit." The washing and the regeneration of the spirit is right here in Ezekiel 36.
Awesome.
Right? Does anybody have any quick questions? Anything they want to share?
Do you want to harken back to Joel's question about what condemnation of the law meant?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Why the addition of condemnation of the law?
Well, if you look at the context in Romans chapter 6 and 7, when he says you're not under the law but under grace, he's referring to being under the law is making reference to being under sin. So we're under sin, we're under the condemnation law because we're sinners, right? So we have died to the law, meaning we died to the condemnation, so we may live, right? Because we died with the Messiah. Messiah died, he took our condemnation, and so that we may live and be able to God. And so that is another study for another time. If you ever decide to study Romans 6, 7, 8. All right. All right. Any more questions? Does everyone kind of understand what I mean by Old and New Covenant? It is not the Tanakh. The New Covenant is not the Apostolic writings. All right. It's not a time period. Right. It's not a different law. Right. What's different of the New Covenant is our response. It was a covenant in which they broke. But he will write the law in our hearts that we may keep his statutes and ordinances. Right? God is taking the initiative in the New Covenant.